As I mentioned, our speaker this morning is Mr. Abe Schestopol. Mr. Schestopol, if you will forgive me for saying so, is a walking historical figure. He was born during World War I. He lived through the great stock market crash of 2929. I assume you meant 1929. He served through the Depression of the 1930s, or he lived, excuse me, through the Depression of the 1930s. He served in World War II. He served in the Korean War. He was a combat aviator in Vietnam. In 1942, as a member of the U.S. Army Air Corps, he flew into an obscure southern city with a strange name, Tallahassee. He landed at Dale Mabry Army Airfield in that city, where he spent the night. The site of Dale Mabry Army Airfield is now the site of, guess what, Tallahassee Community College. In fact, some of the taxiways are still evident in the surrounding area. Thus, his visit today is a sort of homecoming for Mr. Schestopol. Mr. Schestopol was born in 1916. He was educated in the public schools of New York City and at Harvard University. He will be giving us an individual's view of some of the major events of the 20th century. After his talk, he will be available to answer questions. Mr. Schestopol is a retired Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force. He was awarded the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the Air Medal for his service in World War II. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Abe Schestopol. Glad to have you, Abe.
Thank you, Pete, for that introduction. In fact, that was so good, you gave my speech. I can take the applause and sit down.
Yeah, but you wrote the introduction, didn't you?
You know, when Pete learned that my lifespan was equivalent to the 20th century, he suggested that I give a speech about the 20th century. And I said to him, well, that would be too long. They're going to be late getting home to dinner. Not to lunch, but to dinner. So he said, well, why don't you make it one man's journey through the 20th century? And by seeing what happened to one individual, to you, meaning me, they can work backwards and they get an appreciation of the larger events. So that's what we're going to do. It'll be kind of personal, and I forgive me for getting personal here and then, but it'll be a conversation between us, and I'll give you my journey through the 20th century. Now, normally when I speak about a historical period, like a century or a decade or a year, you try to find some big bang to start out with. In this case, it might be Pearl Harbor, the Battle of the Bulge, Hiroshima. But unfortunately, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was no big bang. Not even World War I, because, you know, that came 15 years later. In fact, what I found at the beginning of the 20th century, instead of a big bang, I found a poem. So you might say, how can a poem be the beginning of a century? Well, this poem is on a plaque that's attached to the base of the Statue of Liberty. And it says like this: give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Send them the tempest-tossed to me, and I lift my lamp beside the golden door. And by the hundreds, by the thousands, they came. The Big Bang at the beginning of the 20th century, believe it or not, was immigration. Between 1880 and 1920, 20 million immigrants came to the United States. They came from all over. They came from Africa. Believe it or not, the son of one of those African immigrants is running for president of the United States today. They came from Ireland. They came from Northern Europe. They came from Southern Europe. They came from Eastern Europe. That's where my parents came from, Eastern Europe. And what did they find when they came inside the Golden Door? One word: jobs. America needed workers. The railroads were being built. The telegraph lines were being laid out. The mines were being dug. The factories were being built. And they all needed workers. The women worked, first sewing by hand. And then they came out with that treadle machine. Remember the treadle machine that your mother or your grandmother used to have? And when people were first getting settled in their jobs and the children in school, the guns of August broke out. World War I, August 1914. World War I was a terrible war. People have forgotten about it. It was fought in the trenches. A trench is a ditch 8 feet wide, about 10 feet deep. And you know what's in the bottom? Mud. And the soldiers, the doughboys they call them, they worked in those trenches for 4 years. Every once in a while, the lieutenant would blow a whistle and the doughboys would go over the top and charge the enemy. When you hear somebody today use the expression over the top, he's using a World War I expression out of the trenches. But what made World War I such a terrible war was an American invention. You know, in the Civil War, they had a Gatling gun. It had multiple barrels, and you turned a handle, and it shot the bullets out. Well, there was a gunsmith in New Jersey. His name was Browning. And he had an idea. He said, why do we need multiple barrels? Why don't we use a single barrel, and we'll put the ammunition on a belt. And every time it fires, the firing would move the belt up 1 notch. And that firing would move the belt up another notch and fire. And that's what gave it that rat-tat-tat-tat-tat. So he fiddled around with it in his machine shop, but when he had it working, he got on a train and he went from New Jersey to Washington, D.C. He went to the War Department. We didn't have a Defense Department in those days. There was no Pentagon. And he showed them this invention. And the colonel, if you'll excuse me for saying so, the colonel looked at it and shook his head. He said, our strategy that we teach in West Point is to charge the enemy. And it's too heavy for the soldiers to carry. So it's no good for us. Oh, so Browning wrapped up his gun and he got on his ship and he sailed to England. And he went to Whitehall, which is the UK Defense Department, War Department. And they showed him, Browning showed him the gun. And they looked at it and they said to him, you know, in our strategy, which we teach at Stanhurst, which is their version of West Point, is to charge the enemy. You remember the Crimean War? Into the Valley of Death marched the 400. Well, they can't march into the Valley of Death. Well, this thing is too heavy. So it's no good for us. Well, you know, in the real estate business, they have a philosophy called the 3 L's. Location, location, location. You all know that. Well, Browning had his own philosophy. That was the 3 P's. Persistence, persistence, persistence. Well, he'd been turned down by the Americans. He'd been turned down by the British. So he wrapped up his gun and he got on a ferry and went to the mainland and got on a train to Berlin. And he showed it to the German General Staff. And they had one word, wunderbar. And they said, but there's one thing wrong. And he said to himself, oh boy, here comes this too heaviness. But they said, no, the name is no good. It's too American. The Browning automatic rifle. We're going to call it the machine gun.
Yeah.
And you know, that name has stuck for 100 years. That's what we call it today.
Maschinengewehr.
And they had an answer for the weight, too. You know, the German ingenuity. They made the Mercedes-Benz, they made the BMW, they made the Volkswagen. What they did was build a little tripod. And they put the gun on the tripod, way out here to the left of the battlefield. And they put another one way out here to the right of the battlefield. And in between, they called the field of fire. And guess who came marching up that field of fire?
Yeah.
The British, the French, the Americans. And it was a terrible, terrible loss of life. In fact, the British lost a whole generation of their best young people, because when World War I started, the British schools emptied out, and all the upper class and middle class men went into the army, and they're the ones that marched into the field of fire. Now, between Germany and France, there's a country called Belgium. In the old days, it used to be called Flanders. Now, today it's Belgium. Unfortunately, in today's world, if you're a German, you want to invade France, you have to go through Belgium. If you're a Frenchman, you want to invade Germany, you have to go through Belgium. So here's the battle going back and forth across that poor country. There was one particular city in Belgium called Ypres, Y-P-R-E-S. And the casualties in that city from the battle going back and forth were enormous. And there's a huge cemetery, Pete may have seen it, on the outskirts of Ypres, thousands of white crosses. And the women from the town came out and planted poppies among the crosses. And there must be something about the soil, or maybe, if you forgive me, maybe it was the remains in the soil. But the poppies came up beautiful blood red. And there was a Canadian doctor that happened to be stationed in Ypres at that time. He was sitting outside his tent, and he looked over. His name was John McCrae, a lieutenant colonel like myself. He looked over at the cemetery, and he could see these thousands and thousands of crosses, and there was a light breeze blowing. So the poppies were waving. And he was so overcome with emotion, he took out his pen and he wrote a poem.
Flanders Fields.
In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row. And in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly. You may remember it from your own grade school.
Yeah.
When he got home, he published the poem in his local newspaper. To us, it would be the Tallahassee Democrat. But it made such an impact that it was picked up by the major media and circled around the globe and wound up in every classroom in the English-speaking world. And I'm sure many of you here have encountered it. Well, that was the year 1918. Unfortunately, that was not the only thing that circled the globe in 1918. In 1918, there was a terrible epidemic of influenza, and it literally circled the globe. It was very virulent. A person would come home with a runny nose on a Monday. On Thursday, that person would be dead. There was no penicillin, there was no sulfur, and people died right and left. Unfortunately, my mother was one of the victims of the influenza plague in 1918, and I was 2 years old. And my father was left with 4 children, and he could hardly read and write English. Fortunately for me, he met and married a wonderful human being, and the two of them raised those children to the point where one of them went to Harvard. So you can see what a good job they did. Well, the immigrant generation that I'm talking about were just getting settled in their jobs. The children were getting settled in school. When here comes the debacle of 1929, the stock market crash. Fortunately, the immigrant population was not hit hard by the stock market crash because they didn't have money invested. They were too new to the country. But what happened after the crash was the depression of the 1930s, and that was devastating. With my apologies to Tom Brokaw, to me, the greatest blow to the greatest generation was not World War II, and I forgive you guys. It was a depression. And anybody who has lived through it, I think, will agree with me. The blow to the psyche of us guys who went through the Depression is something that we will never forget, and it'll come up again later on in this talk. If you want to see what the Depression was like, you might rent out the movie The Grapes of Wrath. The only problem is the Grapes of Wrath is rural. It's about farmers. But the depression in the cities was devastating. And that's the kind of depression my family went through. I have to point out there's one thing about the Depression. There's good in everything. And what I like about the 30s was radio. You know, in those days there was no television. And you know, today a radio is the size of a cigarette pack. But in those days, a radio was a piece of furniture. And every house had this radio in the living room. And every night, the whole family would sit around the radio and listen to H.V. Kaltenborn tell the news. And you know, and then they had entertainment programs like the Eddie Cantor Hour, George Burns and Gracie Allen. You remember those programs?
Amos and Andy.
Amos and Andy.
Mama Abner.
There you go.
Yep.
On and on they went. Then, once the war started, there was Edward R. Murrow. This is London. That was Edward.
The overseas service of the
And it was the
BBC.
war with Edward R. Murrow that finally ended the Depression. And I have to tell you this, once Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and World War II started, it was not well received in the United States. It may be uncomfortable for you to remember that there was a lot of ambivalence in the United States. Should we get into this war? Should we stay out of this war? There was an organization called America First, and it was led by an American hero, Charles A. Lindbergh, and they wanted America to stay out of World War II, even though there were hints already about the Holocaust, and there was still ambivalence. Of course, there were people in Washington who were smart enough to know what was going to happen. And number one, they started to draft. And every young man, including myself, you had to have a draft card. It was something like a driver's license ID. And another thing they did was copy the RAF. And they decided to expand the U.S. Army Air Corps. And that's what swept me up in 1940. Well, along came Pearl Harbor. Of course, that swept away the ambivalence. On Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, 1941, I was stationed right up here at Maxwell Field. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was playing touch football